Hello, and welcome to the History Podcast by the Washington State Legislative Internship Program. My name is Thomas DeBow.
And I am Luke Preston.
Today, we're going to be talking about Asian American labor histories in Washington State.
So the idea of this podcast has always been to show current interns, future legislators, anybody who's interested in Washington State's legislative process, the connections between the history of Washington State and the modern legislative process. And so today we're going to talk about, like Tommy said, the history of Asian American immigration and labor rights in the state. But we're going to do so by showing you exactly how far back the context for a modern bill can be. So to do that, well, Tom, we can start as far back as we want for this one.
Yeah.
So let me tell you where we're going to end up, and you can sort of follow this story with us. So this year we're in a short session, and a friend of ours, Representative Bruce Chandler from the 15th District, has sponsored a bill that will require Filipino-American history to be taught in schools, especially in the central Yakima Valley here in Washington. And that makes sense for a lot of reasons that we'll get to. But to get to why that is, we kind of have to go back. We got to go way back. We got to go back to maybe even before Washington was a state. So in your opinion, Tom, where does this story start?
You know, this story starts far before 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. However, because so many of you interns and fellow legislators think that history began in 1776, when really it began with the greatest story ever told, the story of human civilization around the planet. We're going to put that in context. And we have to acknowledge, first of all, that the United States is a very young country.
Absolutely.
And through its lifetime, the United States expanded from 13 colonies across the country through a post-colonial process with the British Empire, through an expansionary process.
And oftentimes beyond the scope that the people conducting said expansion necessarily expected. I mean, you have to remember when the country was founded, Thomas Jefferson never even thought it would go west of the Mississippi. I mean, he was even surprised by the Louisiana Purchase when he made it. And so, yeah, I think what we're realizing is that this is a story of the expansion of the American empire and how it assimilates the people it conquers and absorbs, for better or for worse. I think the expansion of the American empire across North America and then across multiple hemispheres has undoubtedly wrought horrors that any fan of history is well aware of.
And these are, you know, the inheritances of history.
Yeah, and you know, living today in a state as diverse as Washington, we sort of get to live with the silver lining a little bit is an interesting way to say it.
Sure.
But so to look at the history of how East Asian Americans and specifically Filipinos shaped modern Washington State and modern Washington State's legislation, I think there is a point in the expansion of the American empire where things changed in a big way. You know, by 1889, Washington was a state. The West Coast had been largely claimed, and people thought we were done. You know, the empire had expanded to the ocean. Where else could it go? And then what happened, Tom?
Well, in 1898, a ship called the USS Maine, for mysterious reasons, explodes in Havana Harbor in Cuba. And this sets off the Spanish-American War, one of the United States' first
international conflicts, really. I mean, obviously, the British had been over here a couple times.
one of our first interventions abroad in the Pacific.
Yeah.
If not the first. And the USS Maine, lest we forget, the famous slogan "Remember the Maine," was really one of the first rally around the flag moments for what was a unified continental United States of America.
The United States at this point was not necessarily in a position where they could afford to go to war. And, Tom, that's a great phrase, rally around the flag. The outcry over the sinking of the Maine, especially coming up to the election that was going to happen in 1900, put a lot of pressure on the federal government to declare war on Spain. And
that's right. And the Spanish Empire, and as well with the French Empire and the British Empire, were all competitors for the North American continent through the process of decolonization and the post-colonial process of founding an independent nation on the Atlantic coast of North America.
Absolutely.
And so the sort of national rivalries between Spain and France and Britain and the United States, and how those relationships ebbed and flowed through rivalry and alliance over the course of the 19th century, the 18th century, really, really shapes the context for the explosion of the USS Maine. Because at this point in time, Spain is still
a global
power and a major player in the Western Hemisphere.
I think what had happened at this point, that's a great point, is that with the full incorporation of North America by the British and the Americans across Canada and then across the current U.S., by 1846 even, all the way back then, the Spanish had been completely closed out of North America. And in a lot of ways, you talk about national rivalries. The Americans sort of felt like they had the Spanish on the back foot, if we're going to use a boxing analogy. Like, this was their opportunity to assert the fact that they were now going to be not just a world power that rivaled Spain and England, but this was going to get competitive. This was a zero-sum game. And with the Maine and all of the pressure to go to war with Spain, there was a lot of patriotism. There was a lot of rallying around the flag. But this was going to be the death blow to the Spanish Empire. And at the time, the main crowns in the main jewels in the crown, pardon my mix-up, of the Spanish Empire were their islands abroad. And so that would be Cuba, and mainly that would be the Philippines.
As well as Puerto Rico. And as you said,
a number of other islands in the Pacific.
And but that's right. Spain lost its foothold in North America basically by the middle of the 19th century, because Mexico gained independence. The United States acquired Florida and access to New Orleans and the Mississippi River rights. And so, kind of putting this in context, you mentioned Thomas Jefferson and sort of expansion of the United States West, how unthinkable that could be. I mean, the Louisiana Purchase was, how many millions of acres of land for what, $10 million? Right. Now, you adjust that for inflation, that's going to be maybe $1 billion or so. But still, the real estate today, I mean, that is one of the greatest trade deals of all time, to borrow a phrase from a former president.
Yeah, and it made people greedy. It made people go, well, if we've expanded the empire this much, what's an ocean to stop us?
That's exactly right. And so, westward expansion hits the rocky Pacific coast. Yeah, and even by the 1870s, President Ulysses S. Grant talked in the halls of Congress about acquiring Puerto Rico. But that at the time seemed like, too far gone of an idea, beyond imagination for the United States to be setting its sights on things so many hundreds or thousands of miles in the case of the Philippines outside of its immediate sphere of influence.
Right.
But the United States is a rising power, and the explosion of the USS Maine gives just cause for a full-on confrontation with the Spanish Empire, with Spain.
And now you have the U.S. Navy in a position where they are hot off of all of the lessons that they learned during the Civil War in terms of how to build warships. And they have steamships that are lined with lead and very difficult to sink, and more so than anything for their time, fast. And so to take the American fleet to the Spanish is no longer the tall task that it had been. And so with the explosion of the USS Maine and the declaration of war against the Spanish Empire, the U.S. arrives in the Philippines with no question about what their game plan is. They're there to take it. And they did. The Battle of Manila Bay was
it was a blowout.
It was a blowout. It was the demonstration. It was the scoreboard moment where not only were the Spanish humiliated, but all of their allies saw them get humiliated. And moreover, all of the Filipinos that were about to be conquered saw what they were up against. And it was the start of a very dark chapter in Filipino history.
And the Spanish Empire puts up a goose egg in the Philippines.
Absolutely.
Because at this time, the Philippines is a colonial holding of the Spanish Empire, just like Cuba. So the United States basically begins military operations in Cuba, famously with the Rough Riders.
Yep, Teddy Roosevelt and all of them.
That's right. Who I think was maybe vice president at the time, or president, or assistant secretary of the Navy, or whatever he was.
He was assistant secretary of the Navy.
That's right, at the Rough Riders on Kettle Hill. In the Philippines, the Battle of Manila Bay. That's such a deep cut. And Spanish Empire puts up a goose egg, and basically over the course of 1 or 2 years, the Spanish Empire has no presence in the Philippines, and this is sort of a Teutonic shift.
Totally.
Of sort of imperial spheres of influence around the globe, where Spain can no longer assert sort of a monopolistic control over this far off place. And what this confrontation between Spain and the United States engenders is the Filipino-American War, where Filipinos, by and large, resisted sort of a change of claim by a European or by an American power to the Philippines.
That you also have to look at the impact that the American military and American corporations had on the Philippines once it became an American asset.
Yeah.
There were two big things that we did in the Philippines that affect them to this day. One was the implementation of a military system that was it firstly involved a huge U.S. presence in the Philippines, but it also involved this. I would compare it to the system that the British had in India, where they were training and keeping a standing army of Filipinos. It was a standing Filipino army, but it acted as an arm of the United States Armed Forces. And so you had that going on, and you had basically everybody's son getting mandatory exposure to American systems via this military system. But then you had American farming corporations and land speculators coming in And between what they did buying up land and using it for farming and having really no regard for the people or places that they were involving themselves with, they created a system that was almost feudal in the Philippines during this time. And so as a result, you have this very strange, what'd you call it, Tom? A push-pull of simultaneously the U.S. really exacting its will upon an entire people, but then this almost pre-assimilation going on of English schools and American culture kind of seeping over through the military and through these corporations.
Yeah.
And so
a kind of foreign, sort of a mix of a foreign policy and an economic policy entanglement in these overseas assets.
And so what starts to happen as you get into the 20th century is something that had not really happened in the history of the United States, and certainly not in the history of Washington up until this point, which was that, you know, a lot of the diversity in Washington at the turn of the century was through conquered peoples. It was the native Coast Salish people who were still here and still very much part of shaping that culture, but this was their home. We were visitors. And it wasn't until the Filipinos really started coming over in large numbers and both being pushed out of their home and following the promise of kind of the prosperity that America advertised over there, that they started showing up in Washington in large numbers. And so...
And to that, in terms of a pull factor, I mean, there are beyond the sort of ideological aspects of a prosperous rising power that was the United States, which was a historical fact. Mm-hmm. There was also just the basic laws of economics, like gravity.
Yeah,
that there were massive demands for cheap labor.
Yeah,
and this is the exact story with Chinese labor coming overseas on the western part of the United States.
Totally.
Working railroads, which basically precipitates the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which is a measure to protect the bargaining power of white American labor.
Yep. And
so it's really this entanglement.
Yeah.
At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States is having conversations and engaging in processes of acquiring the Philippines, which became, basically a military territory.
Yeah.
Cuba, which became an independent, but basically a satellite of American influence. But beyond that, Puerto Rico was acquired, the Wake Atoll, Guam, among other sort of territories, which some Hawaii as well.
Yeah.
And so this massive influx of Asian American people into the Western United States is really this basically it's a return ticket.
Yeah,
a return ticket.
Exactly. And so you're also looking at, if you're looking at legislation today and looking for the spots at which it ties back into this, you look at places like the Chinese Exclusion Act as spots in which the demographic history of Washington starts to make a little bit more sense. The labor market during this time starts to make a little bit more sense. If the legislature was going to keep Chinese labor out, that's not going to keep landowners and corporation owners from looking for cheap labor.
Right.
And so it essentially that the Chinese Exclusion Act essentially left the door open for Filipinos who wanted to seize that opportunity,
as well as Latin American laborers.
Absolutely. So as we move into the 20th century, we see, kind of the story you all know in Washington State, the rise of Seattle as a fishing port, and the continued tying together of the natural resources of Alaska and Washington. Gold is the big one, but salmon and the industry around salmon, fishing, catching, the machinery, canning primarily, requires a lot of cheap labor. And so there comes a point in the development of industry in Seattle and in kind of the cities that find themselves in Seattle's economic hinterland, that really provides not a foothold, but a vacuum in the market where Filipinos found themselves, for better or for worse. It was viewed as an opportunity by a lot, but was incredibly harsh, and the labor standards were non-existent. It was hard work. It was terrible conditions, and it instilled in, I think, a lot of the Filipino community this feeling of needing to look out for yourself versus the corporate machine a little bit. It sort of was an awareness of class and labor that was felt and lived instead of talked about and taught. And so, as you have successive generations of Filipinos coming over across the ocean, in Filipino, in Spanish, well, edit. In Spanish, the Filipinos would refer to the first wave of immigrants who came over as their older brothers, because they brought with them so much knowledge and so much establishment that they were able to really feel confident when they got here.
Right.
So,
I mean, just as with, just as is the case with westward expansion and some of the untold horrors and suffering that are on the obverse side of what is also now commonly understood as a story of adventure, of expansion, of sort of risk taking, and all those sort of great myths and culture that surrounds the sort of the settling of the West. By in that same vein, you have a similar story of courage and risk taking and
totally
adventure, which is almost a euphemism for what is a very harsh economic reality for so many immigrants coming to the United States, especially into a situation of maybe only relative economic uplift by filtering into the new industrial forces of the Pacific Northwest, canneries,
absolutely,
a scaling up of production of and harvesting of salmon, and
this really goes further than this, though, and you can start to see this story's picking up pace now, because you get compounding generations. You get more and more people are coming over, and they're establishing themselves as a strong part of the workforce, and they're building this ethos of community, and communities are starting to form in urban centers, but they're also starting to form in agricultural centers. And so you get, by the mid-century, a lot of Filipino workers with this strong ethos of organizing and community and self-respect as workers and as kind of participants in the marketplace starting to be some of the predominant players in the agricultural game of Eastern Washington. And so by the 1960s, you have kind of the World War II Bracero program wrapping up.
Yeah.
And the agricultural workers are, by percentage, becoming more and more Filipino. And it's becoming easier for them to organize as a result. And so in 1965, you have famously the kind of the kickoff of the big farm workers union organization process that went on through the 60s with the strikes against grape growers in California. And it was only within 2 years of that, so by 1967, that the United Farm Workers Union had spread to Washington, and the mantle of that union was picked up almost entirely by first and second and third generation Filipino immigrants. And largely that organization was coming out of the Yakima Valley. So you had the working conditions for everyone in Eastern Washington changing rapidly with this rising tide of Filipino labor standards.
Mm-hmm.
And this was something that got national, if not international, attention. This was something that people like Cesar Chavez were involved in, that they came and talked to workers. They came and talked to the farmers that were extremely displeased that this was happening. And it set in motion a view in 20th century Washington of labor as something that was dignified, and increasingly something that the legislature had to pay attention to. It was by the early 70s even that unions amongst today they're wrongly called unskilled trades, but field work and factory work and cannery work that was spreading outside of public institutions. So, you had in the mid 20th century, like if you wanted a factory job that was safe and well paying, you went somewhere that the government was paying for, like Boeing. But increasingly, it became that, you could go work in a private factory that you expected to look after you as a worker. And who did it fall on to keep you safe if your union was being disrespected or your health was being jeopardized? And in those cases, it wasn't the state-sponsored factory. It was the state labor board. They kind of got put in a position where for the first time they were being asked to do their jobs in a way that was far more broad than it had been before. And so by the end of the 70s, you have Filipino communities here that are well established, and you have unions that are fully fleshed out and connected and understand their relationship with the state legislature. And you move into the 21st century with a very concrete example of how the history of sort of Washington's constantly shifting demographics are always going to be front of mind for the legislature.
Indeed. And talking about 1967, 1965, with the grape grower strikes, Cesar Chavez famously cooperating, or rather collaborating with Filipino workers in Eastern Washington. This really brings to mind the importance, or rather the significance, of labor as such in this equation. And we talk about dignity in labor, and labor is really the operative word in the economic transaction, or equation rather, of what's happening. So I'm going to go ahead and read just a paragraph or two from A History Bursting with Telling, Asian Americans in Washington State, developed by Matthew W. Klingel, Center for Study of the Pacific Northwest, University of Washington Department of History. Now, in Washington State, the 1889 state constitution, in Section 33 of Article 2, prohibited resident aliens from owning land. In 1921 and 1922, the rule was extended to leasing, renting, and sharecropping of land. The 1924 Act sanctioned further discrimination, especially against the growing Filipino population. Filipinos themselves were the object of racist fears over mixed marriages and dwindling jobs. In 1927, whites expelled Filipino farmers from Topanish in the Yakima Valley. In 1933, white farmers and workers in Wapato demanded that area growers stop hiring Filipino workers. So we have, an understandable backlash of a multi-ethnic and evolving economy at this point in time in the early 20th century. Now, leading up to 1965 and 1967, and just before World War II, which is just a massive hinge point in the trajectory of the American economy writ large. In 1937, the Washington legislature tried to pass a law banning mixed-race marriages. Obviously, it failed. And Filipinos were added as resident aliens under state law in 1938. And the anti-alien land laws directed against them and other Asian Americans were not repealed until 1966.
Oh my God.
So one thing
that
to keep
late,
in mind,
really? 1966.
right, as resident aliens,
And this was federally or by the Washington State Legislature?
the state legislature.
Wow.
So something to keep in mind on the significance of labor is that the only way to build equity as immigrant communities, as ethnic communities coming from abroad, was labor income. No part of the equation of building equity or wealth in these ethnic economies had to do with owning assets, owning land, leasing land, renting land, or even sharecropping on the land you worked.
And that's just at base. I mean, the difficulties that presents in terms of starting a business, building, any type of appreciating capital for families. I mean, it's completely debasing.
Forget it. So the sole form of any kind of subsistence was the exchange of labor for income. And this is why the significance of labor is just so fundamental to the development and the transition of Filipinos from an ethnic unskilled worker to, almost by necessity, having to organize, having to demand dignity in labor through what are labor relations.
Oh, you're saying that was the pejorative position that they were placed in by white America, was this expectation of being unskilled, and that they were able to construct and organize their way out of that. Yeah.
Well, think about it. When your only way of surviving in a country that you have either been pushed into or pulled into is by, being a participant, being a worker in a workplace, but only that, and not by all of the other economic transactions of converting that income into wealth. You are solely dependent on labor income, and so labor organizing for for union protection, and because all of those eggs
Yeah,
are in the labor income basket. It's
absolutely.
the only way to go. And what's interesting is the anti-alien land law that excluded Asian Americans, or rather Filipinos, from owning land in Washington State was not repealed until 1967, and we have the Senate bill.
No.
Okay?
Okay.
So this is...
So, ladies and gentlemen listening at home, Tom has produced from seemingly nowhere the bill from 1967, from the 1967 legislature and the Senate specifically.
Yeah.
So what is the bill number? Do you have that?
Yeah, we do. Bill number 88.
Okay.
Senate bill number 88.
They had a different nomenclature.
And
back then.
and keep in mind that the very same Washington State legislative internship program that hosts this podcast would have been in its 12th year. No. Would have been in its 12th year. And look, these this history is the mirror, and we're looking into the mirror, and we see ourselves and we see things we like and that we don't like, but we have to be objective about it. So this is Session Laws of 1967. So this is the RCW. But this, of course, this repeal of the anti-alien land laws spawned from a piece of legislation under the dome, Senate Bill number 88. And the purpose of this act, after the enacting clause,
Yeah.
any alien may acquire and hold lands or any right thereto or interest therein by purchase, devise, or descent, and he or she may convey, mortgage, and devise the same, and if he or she shall die intestate, the same shall descend to his or her heirs, and in all cases such lands shall be held, conveyed, mortgaged, or devised, or shall descend in like manner, and with like effect, as if such alien were a native citizen of this state or of the United States.
Wow.
And so this is really a crescendo, I think from our vantage point,
Definitely.
a crescendo of a massive legal shift in the landowning rights of Filipino Americans, who up until this point were only considered Filipino, alien Filipinos, and not necessarily Filipino Americans, because likewise, the United States was going through a process of integration and desegregation. But this is the upswell and the crescendo point that really neatly complements the emergence and, in some cases, the triumphs of a Filipino workers' movement, both in the canneries, but also in the Yakima Valley, on the farms, and in the context of a stratification of labor. And just to your point of unskilled labor, and whether or not that's a myth or that's neither here nor there, but Larry Itlong, who you mentioned, also known as Nine Finger Larry.
True.
Because he lost one of his digits in the workplace.
Yeah. It's a long story, clearly, if you've listened this far. And one I think that it's one of just many stories that really hammer home why history matters to current legislation. And I think to really prove that, you can listen to this bill, and I'm going to read a bill in just a second. I'm going to read a section of it. And in it, you can hear exactly why understanding history is so important to understanding why a bill would be important, especially this bill. And so just understanding that context is always your friend. So this is House Bill 1749, written by Representative Bruce Chandler this year. And I'll read section 1. The legislature recognizes that Washington state has a vibrant Filipino-American population that enriches our cultural, economic, and societal institutions. The legislature recognizes also that Filipino Americans have served honorably in the United States' armed services, defending and protecting the country throughout its history. The legislature, therefore, intends to direct the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction to identify and make available educational materials and resources that acknowledge the numerous and valuable contributions of Filipino Americans to the history and culture of Washington and the United States. And I think that what that shows is that these stories are not just important to legislating in Washington state, but being an informed and participatory citizen in Washington state. And so we hope that having listened to this and keeping this mindset as you go into the next episode and go into your career in public service, that the context of history in Washington state, more so than most places in the world, is this tapestry of time stacked on top of each other that you really can't understand one piece of until you've dug up everything that it's attached to.
That's right. So in the scope of this podcast, we hope that you learn something about the trajectory of an American empire. Empire is a little subjective. People can argue about that. But the trajectory of the United States as a global superpower.
Absolutely.
With a reach well beyond shining coast and coast.
Yes.
Or shining sea to sea.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly.
And, hopefully that you learn something about the dynamics, the power dynamics, the military tensions, some of the economic change, whether that was through industry or whether that was through the workplace and labor, and just how it came to be that, Asian Americans began integrating to the United States and to Washington state, and how the legislature is such a centerpiece, sort of keystone in the legal framework and the social fabric that keeps the state which maintains the shape of what the state is and how it changes.
Absolutely.
And so if you found this podcast to be interesting, all credit goes to Luke, and if you didn't, all credit goes to me. Okay,
Thank
so
you very
heads you win, tails I lose.
Fantastic.
Luke.
Thank you very much for listening, everybody. This has been the Washington State Legislative Internship History Podcast. We hope you will tune in for our next episode.
That's right.
Washington, our home.